really delighted to be here to think about the power of adornment and how we might frame that in the past and in the present, and then looking into our futures. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, mō tō tautoko o te kaupapa o te rānei e. Ko tainui te waka, ko rangiahua te maunga, ko wainui te awa, ko tōrere nui ārua te tipuna, ko ngaitai te iwi, ko Maya Jessup Nuku ahau. I greet you in the reo, or the language of part of my ancestry on my mother and grandmother's side. And what I've done is just say my pepeha, so I've just announced my mountain, my river, and my tipuna, or my female ancestress, whose image is actually inscribed into a gable figure or wooden carving at the top of our meeting house on the east coast of New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And what that does is really ground me in the landscape, conceptual and literal, of one part of my personhood. And I'm now going to continue in English to honour and respect the legacy of my father's side, and he's a Scouse, or a Liverpudlian from England, and London is where I was born and raised. And I thought I'd just begin our discussion by thinking about, as I've said, the kind of broader sense of what it is that jewellery does, or adornment in its fuller sense. And as you just so beautifully opened up for us, jewellery was really the first art form, and it enters the archaeological record tens of thousands of years before the cave paintings and sculpted figurines that we pull out of the earth. And indeed, adorning oneself competes with language and the creation of tools as a marker of humanity. And that's to say that humans across every culture and time period have defined themselves by engaging in this deeply profound and meaningful act, adorning the body. But it's easy to claim the universality of adornment, but thinking about the wearing of jewellery and the modification of the body and how we adorn it, it's slightly more difficult to define precisely in terms of what it's doing. And it's harder still to understand how it works, perhaps, and why we do it. And I'm interested in the kind of active agency of adornment and its implications. And I did think I would just allude to this exhibition that the Metropolitan put on. It closed actually in February this year. And I had a small part to play in pulling out some oceanic artworks that were part of a cluster of works in what was a huge exhibition, and it involved a whole team of 6 curators who led other teams throughout the museum. And the idea was really to figure out how adornment works to extend and amplify different parts of the human physique. And that very foundation of the body permits an exploration of how jewellery acts upon and transforms us, activates even the body that it adorns. So encompassing the grand traditions of adornment found throughout the world, these themes and ideas were organised into 5 main categories, and I've flashed them up on the screen there for you now. And I think they're useful categories just to bear in mind as we have our discussion this afternoon. The alluring body, the transcendent body, the resplendent body, the regal body, and the divine body. And I'll play just quickly the sizzle reel for the show, which maps out the rationale for the exhibition.
Because jewelry is often small scale, you might overlook it. This is an exhibition that is meant to kind of pull out those small treasures, drawn almost entirely from the Met's collection, taking this global approach alongside sculptures, paintings, photographs to enrich the kinds of stories we're trying to tell about jewelry. What distinguishes jewelry from any other art form? It's worn on the human body. In fact, the very center of the whole exhibition will take you from toe to head. We're actually trying to insert the body and the practices around jewelry back into the discussion. It's as much about aesthetics as it is about meaning. Adornment is one of the most meaningful activities that we engage in. Jewelry is often linked to the gods and is often linked to royalty. Specifically looking at Oceanic material, we learned of the importance of jewelry in invoking ancestors, but this is something we also see in the West. When we have jewelry that includes the hair of your grandmother, family memory is a meaning that jewelry carries across cultures throughout the show. We'll look at how jewelry engenders desire, making us bodies to be looked at. The show certainly includes some of the great names in jewelry: Tiffany, Lalique, Cartier, Boucheron, alongside contemporary jewelers Calder, Schiaparelli, or Chanlin, who are manipulating the body to the extreme. This is a show that really speaks to those magical qualities of jewelry, to remind us that jewelry has a kind of agency that both carries meaning and that does something to us when we wear it.
Great, so let's think about these burial ornaments that were in the show accompanying one of the wives of Thutmose III. And unfortunately, her individual name has not been unearthed. So at this stage, archaeologists simply refer to her as, in the context of her royal husband, who gifted her this suite of golden objects, which were used to cover her prepared body in burial. So in the ancient world, jewelry was a highly effective way for individuals to link themselves to the divine, with the past and with ancestors. And this range of works combines potent materials and iconography in order to protect the woman and to transport her safely from this world to the next. So a set of gold foil amulets were created for her eternal protection. And these wonderful sandals and what are called toe stalls that you see on the bottom of the screen to the right, and a set of finger stalls signify her elite status, since they were only found in the highest ranking burials, providing extravagant protection to the most vulnerable extremities of an individual. So while the metal had a potency in its own right, significant efficacy was added by transforming the plain gold into specific items embedded with iconographic meaning. So the broad collar of falcon terminals defended her vulnerable neck, and the winged vulture that spread its protective wings across the queen's chest was also identified as female. And most important of all was this large scarab that you see suspended from that collar at the top of the screen. And that's inscribed with the queen's name and a kind of incantational spell designed to protect her heart and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. So these symbols gave her body and ultimately her spirit the best possible chance at a successful resurrection. And it's this sense that jewelry is far from being a mere ornament that I'm trying to get at. It's an active participant in the formation of identity. In other words, these bejeweled objects, which might at first be considered inanimate, were not limited to a passive, decorative, or symbolic function. They could do things, and they could make things happen. So I'm going to switch now, because I've only got a really brief time, to think about this idea of active agency in the realm that I deal with in the museum, and that I am thinking about a lot in terms of the curatorial work that I do. And it's this idea of active agency and the invoking of ancestors. And it's very relevant to the art and practice of adornment in Oceania. And I wanted to focus specifically on tā moko, which is the modification of the body through tattooing. And the art of tattooing is a really distinctive art practice that's really having a resurgence in Aotearoa, New Zealand today and throughout the Pacific, and it's deeply embedded with cultural significance. So if adornment always exists in conversation with the body, then this form really derives power, or mana, that's a kind of personal prestige or sanctity. Mana is the name we give that to that concept in Polynesia. It derives that from its particular intimacy with the body. In this case, it forms a permanent inscription of incised lines on the skin. So for women, the customary lines applied to the chin and lips are called moko kowai, and this was a practice that was prohibited by missionaries and early colonial authorities in New Zealand, and it really almost died out in the 1920s, and there were a handful of kaumātua, these kuia elders, who carried the moko kowai, and they became the inspiration for a whole new generation of young women, wahine Māori in New Zealand, who wanted to adopt this practice and revive it. So facial tattooing in particular gives observers or people who encounter someone, particular clues as to your social status and your affiliation. And it's a means by which one can read ancestral lines and trace genealogy. The intricate designs are a visible index of just that, your genealogy. And that is a term known as whakapapa. And whakapapa is literally to make layers, papa being a foundation, like the earth, and creating this kind of layering of ancestral lines. So the uhi, which is a bird bone chisel, is the customary way to kind of layer those delicate grooves into the skin, and then the ink goes into that landscape and then sinks into that. And so for women who take the moko kowai, the sense is that those lines are actually already present on the inside, and that the tohunga is actually just pulling those out when he's designing the act of actually kind of inscribing those lines on the lips and chin. So that line between its interior and exterior in kind of self and adornment is really blurred. And the two are interwoven and constantly in dialogue with each other, so that those ancestral lines, the one's forebears, can really be kind of drawn up from the past and be active and relevant in the present. And these photographs are part of an archive that actually sits in the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, New Zealand. And they were just simply named, portrait of Māori woman, a name unknown. And there was a huge repatriation project where these photographs were brought out and put on exhibition, and then the local iwi or tribal groups came in and actually identified their relations and their aunties and their great-great-grandmothers. And so now we have like a much clearer idea of who these women are. And so that's Betty Karaitiana on the left, and Mary Maho on the right, and then Mary Maho on the left. So women talk about the transformative aspects of moko kowai. Rather like childbirth, it's a declaration of status that carries with it specific responsibilities. And it requires one to behave in a certain way in order to rise up and honour the kowai, the ancestors that are inferred in the lines that you're wearing yourself. So ultimately, I think that's the most intriguing and perhaps enticing part of endowment. By engaging in these transformative and deeply profound acts that comment on the major transitions and thresholds and rites of passage in life, we can and do turn ourselves into works of art. So the body is that vehicle for ancestral agency and action. And I'm going to end there and pass on to Ayana, who's, and then Dorian. So we're going to be able to kind of show some of the more specific ways that women and artists have been and are engaging in this vein of action across the centuries. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. I'm so grateful to be sharing a preview of my work alongside such esteemed scholars in adornment, fashion, and museum studies. Thank you, Milani, for this amazing introduction. I want to add that before I was Dr. Fluellen, I was and remained the daughter of Dr. Rona Carter, who was the daughter of the recently passed Sally Mae Rohorn, who was the daughter of W. Lee Tyler, who was the daughter of Susie Ella Armstead, who was the daughter of Lydia Lily Russell, and who was the daughter of Susan Shaw. I am the daughter of 6 generations of African American women who were born in Texas. 5 who labored in the cotton fields and in the homes of white employers as domestic servants in Falls County, Texas. The work I'm going to speak on today is an ode to the lived experiences of my maternal mothers. This work is an exploration into how these women adorned their bodies while fashioning themselves lives worth living in the post-emancipation era in Texas. So I'm going to briefly spend some time discussing my first book project, currently in preparation, called The Black Feminist Archaeology of Adornment, and then I'm going to dive into a bit of my current research on the island of St. Croix. So I want to start with my roots. I'm going to start in Texas. In the midst of social reform and the rise of mass-produced goods that defined the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black women were pinning up their hair with combs, lacing glass beads around their necks, dyeing coarse cotton with sumac berries and walnuts, and fastening buttons to adorn their bodies and dress their social lives. Within my book project, I asked, how did race, gender, and class operations of power and oppression shape African American women's identity formation during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Texas? Within the book, I addressed this question using archaeological and documentary evidence by investigating why and how African American women engaged in particular sartorial practices in Texas from 1865 to 1910. And within the interpretations, I focused specifically on the ways sartorial practices were shaped by the matrix of domination within spheres of labor, as well as due to the threat of racial sexual violence, desires for self-expression, and just as importantly, processes of social reproduction. Material culture data used were clothing and adornment artifacts and clothing maintenance artifacts recovered from the Levee Jordan plantation, a plantation site about 60 miles south of Houston, Texas, where African American families labored and lived as tenant, wage laborers, and sharecroppers. It's the buttons, buckles, hook and eyes, along with hair combs and jewelry, which are a testament to the ways tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and wage laborers who lived and worked and lived at the Levee Jordan plantation during the post-bellum era engaged in sartorial practices. Within historical archaeology, scholarship on adornment, the multivariate meanings behind artifacts recovered and the archaeological record that relate to dress practices are tools for the formations of identities. Identity analysis within the field of archaeology provides the foundation for adornment studies, paving an avenue for historical archaeologists to interpret past formations of identity by critically examining small things. I put this alongside documentary evidence, including Works Progress Administration ex-slave narratives, Sears and Roebuck catalog advertisements, as well as stereo views like the one you see on the screen from African Americans that date to the mid-19th and early 20th centuries. Within the book, I explore everyday sartorial practices, how people dress their bodies for their everyday lives, as practices of self-making that, through their repetitive, daily engagement, constitute the body and form identities. Building off the work of Mary Ellen Roch-Higgins and Joan B. Etchner, who are 2 cultural anthropologists, I define sartorial practices as social cultural practices shaped by many intersecting operations of power and oppression, including racism, sexism, and classism, that involve modifications to the corporal form, so thinking about scarification, body piercings, and hair alteration, as well as all 3D supplements added to the body, so thinking about clothing, hair combs, and jewelry. The emphasis on intersecting operations of power and oppression, including racism, sexism, and classism, within my definition, really draw on articulations of Black feminist thought by Kimbrough Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. So I'm going to pull one of my favorite examples of sartorial practices from the text by drawing your attention to Hester Holmes on the screen. This is a late 19th century image of Hester Holmes, who, as an enslaved woman, labored at the Levee Jordan plantation in the main house and remained as a house servant after emancipation. She's wearing a short gown, fastened with hook and eyes around her waist. Her hair is pulled back and covered in a headscarf. Her hands are interlaced as she stares back at us. Her attire, rest as a representation of how she maintained the Jordan home, clean and modest. This would have been the clothing that Miss Holmes wore as she completed her daily tasks as a domestic servant, cooking, cleaning, laundering, and mending clothing for the Jordans, to then return to her own cabin and do her own homekeeping work, while perhaps even maintaining her own garden for subsistence needs. I look at Esther Holmes and I wonder what negotiations Black women were having with processes of racialization, sexual exploitation, and economic disenfranchisement, and how that impacted her dress. I argue that constructions of Black womanhood were embedded in relations and ideologies of race, gender, and class. Further, I argue that Black women as historical agents negotiated these operations of power and oppression through dress within the context of labor, violence, social reproduction, and, just as significantly, desire and creativity. Given the relationship between fashion and hegemonic notions of femininity, my interpretation suggests that women's clothing and adornment practices were representations of the complex entanglement of resistance and conformity to these notions. The clothing that African American women wore while doing agricultural labor is tied to negotiations of femininity and the realities of racial, gender, and class subjection, and the necessity for functional clothing needed for rural Southern agricultural labor. Although African American women tended to land cooked over hearths, sewed and mended and washed clothing, gender ideology about women's appropriate dress was so influential that Black women often adhered to it, even though the clothes that they wore were often impractical for the kinds of labor that they had to do. The clothing African American women wore was very restrictive in many means in terms of what you had to do in the agricultural fields. Within this project, I really attempt to move away from notions of resistance versus conformity by acknowledging that African American women in their constructions of identity occupy a space of contradiction. Because Black women are outsiders within, they dress themselves and live their lives in ways that illustrate the simultaneity of being woman, yet still outside the normalized ideas of femininity and womanhood. The palimpsest, or layers of histories of oppression written onto the flesh of these women, position them outside of what is deemed acceptable. As a result, African American women and their dress practices were neither fully liberating nor completely oppressive. Rather, their experiences were a complex negotiation of power and how to maintain dignity in defining oneself as African American woman, mother, laborer, as a form of empowerment. So I'm going to quickly shift to the Caribbean, so take a journey with me from Texas to St. Croix, and speak a bit about my current project that's expanded my work to the U.S. Virgin Islands. So since 2016, under the umbrella of the Slave Rights Project, which is a joint program between the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as well as George Washington University, and through my engagement with the Society of Black Archaeologists, I've been excavating at the estate Little Princess, which is an 18th century Danish sugar plantation, exploring Afro-Caribbean lifeways from enslavement through freedom. This work at the estate really expands the time frame in which I'm examining from 1749, when the estate was established by Danish planters, to 1910, well, to 1917, my apologies, when St. Croix, along with St. Thomas and St. John, were sold by Denmark to the United States. What this ultimately means is that I'm taking a look at the wide diversity, both ethnically and culturally, of people who occupied the islands during a near 300-year span. The Slave Voyages database has made it possible to gauge the number of enslaved Africans purchased and brought to the islands, documenting the ports along the African coast from every ship that crossed the Atlantic. What this demonstrates is the wide diversity of people from the continent of Africa being forcibly brought to the island. This, along with the former Danish West Indies having open ports, meaning that ships from a wide variety of European nations could easily come and go from the islands, meant that the number of people, goods, and ideologies about race and gender from European and African contexts played out on people's bodies. So I'm going to conclude this presentation with an image of two house servants who labored at the estate Little Princess circa 1890. The man is wearing a top hat, trousers, and a button frock. The woman has her hair pulled back and covered with a scarf. She's wearing a gown. She's wearing a gown and a long petticoat that falls to her ankles with an apron. Their hands are intertwined as they stare back at the camera. The back of the photograph reads, Nana Hetty, about 1890. Less than 50 years after the abolition of slavery in the Danish West Indies, I wonder how Nettie Hede, her ancestors, and her descendants who labored and lived at the estate Little Princess constituted their existence through everyday quotidian practices of self-making. I wonder about market accessibility, what goods, what textiles, what fasteners were available. I wonder about craft production that took place to create their clothing, what plants were used for handmade dyes, what labor went into flattening bone to carve buttons, what knowledge was passed down about how to cut, stitch, and thread together cloth for undergarments and petticoats. I wonder about the colonial sumptuary laws in the Danish West Indies that legislated what people of African descent, those enslaved and quote-unquote legally free, could and could not wear, and how these lives impacted their livelihoods and played out on people's bodies. My curiosity is ever expanding. And this work is ongoing. I actually flew here from St. Croix and will be returning tomorrow to complete our third field season along with 5 of my colleagues, Drs. Justin Donovan, Alicia Odewale, Alexander Jones, and William White, as well as 7 amazing and bright young African-American women from Spelman, Morgan, and Howard University. So really pulling in a lot of strong Black feminine energy into a rather predominantly white male field. But thank you for listening and engaging. I look forward to seeing you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? A little closer. All right, here we go. Thank you, Milani, for having me. And I hope he's in the audience, but thank you to Jabari, who also worked on the film, for connecting me with Milani. He definitely supported me physically, making sure my body was aligned while working 10 to 16-hour days on the film. So thank you if you're here. My name is Dorian Fletcher. I am an artist and a jewelry designer. The intention behind my jewelry is I create to adorn pretty much the spirit of the woman, a feminine energy. My work is to appreciate the human form, the female form, and to tell the story using the initial communication tool of adornments to tell the story of the woman who's wearing it. And so that has been, up to this point, the intention of my work, to tell the world who that woman is. I mean, most of the women who have worn my work are amazing, strong, beautiful women who dare to take chances, whether it's in their personal life or in their public life. So I'm here to talk about adorning Wakanda. So before this, in 2000, I believe it was 2015, I wanted to be an extra for Roots. And I was working in the struggling artist story, and at the time I knew the money. And so I was an extra. I went in for the fitting. And I had met this woman named Ruth Carter at one of my jewelry parties that my mentor, CCH Pounder, had hosted for me during the time I was trying to find my clientele. And Ruth was interested in my work, but I knew she was really busy. I didn't know what she did at the time. So I went to this fitting for Roots, and they put me in this costume, and they said, let's take you to the costume designer. So Ruth saw me. She said, what are you doing? Take that off, come back here and work with us. So that's what I did. I came in the following day, and she wasn't there. She gave me a call, and she said, I need you to create pieces for the enslaved people's first Christmas in the States, and you have to do it today. And that's how she works. So I said, okay. I had my phone, brought up Google. There was no information, of course, about what adornments looked like pre-slavery. So at that moment, I had an emotional reaction as a person who adorns people. It's accessories, but I don't consider it a fashion statement for me. It's really about creating something for the soul of that person. And so I looked it up and I had an emotional reaction because I could not understand how it felt to be an artisan at that time, having those things stripped from you, your identity stripped from you, and put into a place where you have to be a slave. So I created some pieces. I didn't really have time to create, so I created what I thought I was supposed to create. I created some masks, some headdresses, some necklaces out of, what did she get? It was twine, hats, flowers for Michaels, just different things. And she loved it. It was a moment for her to see my work ethic and to see how I could just create, pull from something within my spirit and bring it to the table. So we're going to place that story on the table, and I'll come back to that. After that, I started having these dreams and these visions of pieces made out of shells, cowrie shells, and feathers and crystals. And I sketched them down, put them to the side, and I started creating this collection that was calling out to my tribe. It was quite difficult as someone who adorns, who does not understand or who doesn't fit into that box of the typical jewelry designer. How do I get my work out there? So I created this collection that really was calling out to those people. Where is my tribe? Who can understand this process of adorning for the spirit? I texted Ruth and I said, I'm having these dreams. I don't know what they're for, but I'm having these dreams of these pieces. Can you help me? Has there ever been a jeweler who has created for a movie before, specifically hired for a movie? And she said, yes. At the time, not really, but she told me yes, so I said, okay, all right. So I showed her the pieces, and she said, this is fantastic. Do you think you can actually make these? I said, yes. They looked like Dinka corsets, Maasai necklaces, but stretched out to where they were flared out as a huge disc on a woman's neck. And I told her yes. I had never made them, but I said yes, I can. She said, well, I'm being considered for this Afrofuturistic gig. If I get it, please move back to LA and you can make the jewelry for this gig, if I get it. That ended up being Black Panther. So one day they invited me to, initially, we had a discussion. We talked about my interest in Maasai work, Tore, Zulu beading. I had spent some time in South Africa learning about the functionality of jewelry within the Zulu culture. And she was interested in working with me. I had an interest in Art Smith. I had an interest in Alexander Calder. So she understood I knew I had a scope of adorning and what that could look like. She told me what Wakanda was, who the people were, how they walked through their everyday life, based on the first script. So Wakandans, they're proud to be Wakandan. They don't need to boast to the world because they know who they are. So she was like, all right, come in and let's start working. So she brought me into a meeting and said, you need to make armor. You need to make buckles. You need to make everything on this list. And they gave me an illustration. I said, okay, never made it before. But I said, sure. And this is what came out of that as far as the metal work, the necklaces, even the simple details of the foot pieces on the Dora Milaje's footwear. So that's what happened with that. Angela Bassett's piece. This was my absolute favorite piece to create. I had never really melded metal and fabric together. The intention behind the piece was, it's Queen Ramonda. She is the Queen Mother. She is the one to guide Wakanda with the king, to make sure that the way that the country is guided is in alignment with their rules and the spiritual aspects and the aspects of the country. So this piece, this was created and crafted after creating the Dora Milaje pieces. And so at that time, it was quite challenging to get out of creating those pieces into something more creative. But she trusted me and my creativity, so the initial one I made was not like this. It was very normal, just basic shapes. And she looked at it, she said, this is not Dorian enough. You need to add more of your aesthetic to it. So I said, okay. I took a lot of the stuff off and added the amethyst. They're gold-plated amethyst, titanium-plated amethyst, and then there's my own wire work at the bottom of the piece. And then I wish they had the back of it on the image, because it was definitely quite fascinating how to create different shapes and triangles in the back, which I assumed that she wanted it to look like a spiritual piece. So this is behind the scenes. They told me initially, Dorian, we need two sets of armor for the door. So I said, okay. I knocked those out. I finished, they said, actually, we forgot we need 12. So I spent a few weeks, and thankfully the costume department supported me, but this is what it looked like before it became those fascinating silver-plated and gold-plated pieces. It was a great experience. It was definitely taxing, as I said, working 10 to 14 or 16 hours a day, making sure that these were created before they started shooting. So that was a lot of the work behind the scenes. I know I get a lot of interview questions where people are asking, how did it feel adorning Wakanda? How did it feel to work with the cast? But on a day-to-day basis, this is what it looked like. Really cutting things out, hammering them, soldering them, making sure they fit the cast well, making sure that they reticulated properly, so when they were doing their scenes, they worked. We just needed it to work. So that's me crafting the beginning of the film when they are Warrior Falls, when they are approaching Warrior Falls. There's a scene where all of the Dora Milaje are wearing these bangles, and they had to wear stacks of bangles, and they had to make noise while they danced, and they celebrated this process of T'Challa fighting for King, to be the Black Panther. And so again, behind the scenes, what that looked like was cutting out by hand and crafting out of aluminum 1,050 pieces of pieces to thread them, create these bangles, color them, and make sure that in water they made noise. So it was definitely a challenge, and it was definitely, which is a lot of the work. A lot of the work is a challenge. A lot of my clients want things that are not, that are unique. And figuring out how to make that work on the human body is it's a challenge, and it's such a rewarding thing to do, because they can step out and look absolutely stunning. They look like goddesses. This is the little one that was, oh, he's right there. Hi. So as I said before, up until this point, my work has been very external, making sure that when women walk out into the world, they are communicating to others who they are. They're communicating to others how strong they are, their status in their society. But since having a child, that has definitely shifted. Or I'll say it's added a different perspective to why I create. Having to, for myself, I always go out with tons of things on, tons of adornments on. I'm pretty simple today. I've had to strip myself of that and pretty much become fully transformed to be a mother. I can't wear those things, he'll tear it off my body. And so because of that, it's made me look internally to why do I adorn others and why do I adorn myself? What does it mean? And I've realized that with the stresses of being a new mom and dealing with, especially within our society right now, there's so many things coming at us, whether it's whatever it is. Everyone has their own set of things that they deal with. I realized that before I stepped out into the world, I needed to make sure that I was okay, that I was confident within myself, and that I was communicating to myself who I was, and remembering that before I stepped out into the world. So because of that, my intention with the crystals I use, the shapes I use, is different. It's totally different. And so now when I create for my clients, I start with that. Who are you? What do you need to remember about yourself before I start creating? Before it was, what are you trying to say to other people? But it's definitely become an internal thing, so it's more of a spiritual tool to be able to communicate to oneself. So, the first story I put on the table, and I want to bring that back in regards to the collection that I made before starting Black Panther. It was a call out to my tribe. I created this collection called Messengers, and it was my call to my tribe, and the intention was to create these beings that were reminding us of our innate spiritual mandate and birthright to live a life of beauty, share our gifts with others, and do it unapologetically. So I'm going to share some of these pieces with you. This is me. I'm the model, creative director, and then the drawer.